Hey, how's it going? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Gabby, and today we're going to be doing my January wrap-up. In the month of January, I read a total of 22 books, and it was a very great reading month. I was working on so many reading vlogs during this month. Like, if you missed it, this month I posted a reading vlog where I read some popular books from 2022 according to Goodreads, and then I also did a new vlog where I read 3 new published thrillers that I was very excited about, and I also very recently just posted a video where I read horror book recommendations from TikTok. And also on my Patreon, I ended up doing an exclusive reading vlog for my Patreon this month where I read the 3 books that I pulled out of my Patreon prompt jar, and so that was also a really fun vlog to work on. I just feel like I was working on vlogs all month long, and it was a really great time. And before we jump into all of the books that I read this month, I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you so much to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. You might be familiar with Skillshare because of their creative classes like photography and illustration and design, but you might not know that Skillshare also has a lot of different career-focused classes as well. I think Skillshare is an amazing resource whether you're trying to learn a new creative skill or get better at skills that you already have. It can be really intimidating trying to create new goals and think of the bigger picture, but you gotta start somewhere. No goal is too small. I think Skillshare is also very useful if you're potentially starting a new business or starting a side hustle and you want to learn some freelance tips, or also just to learn what it takes to break into the creative industry. I recently just started taking this class called Build Your Business and Brand, Translating Your Passion into a Plan, that's actually taught by Rebecca Minkoff, who's an author that I'm actually familiar with. And this class has been really helpful, you know, for someone like me who is currently working on building a business and a brand, and it's very useful to hear tips from someone who knows what they're talking about. But of course, you know, as mentioned, if that class does not interest you, they do offer so many other classes. There really is something for everyone, and I definitely think it's worth taking the time to look through. So the next 1,000 people to use the link down in my description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare so that you can explore your creativity as well. And thank you so much to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video, and now let's get on to the wrap-up. Alright, so before jumping into the books, let's discuss all the manga that I read this month. I read 6 manga out of the 22 books that I read, and the manga was mostly a huge success this month because I started off reading Orange Collection Volume 2. This is actually, it's volumes 4 and 5, but it's the second collection, and Orange has become my new favorite thing ever. This was a 5-star for me. I mean, gosh, look at all these freaking tabs. Like, I am obsessed with Orange, and if you have no idea what Orange is even about, it's basically this young adult kind of like sci-fi romance where we follow this group of teens who are friends in high school, and our protagonist, this girl, starts receiving letters from herself 10 years in the future talking about how she regrets something that happened in her teenagehood and she wants her to change their fate. Oh my god, this story just means so much to me. This was such a goddamn beautiful manga. It's probably my favorite manga that I've ever read. Like, I'm not even gonna lie, it means so much to me. It was beautiful. I freaking cried at the end of this manga. Like, it was so freaking good. And so this was 5 stars. And then I picked up Orange Future, which this one's actually 1 volume that this author came out with a little later on that's describing the same, it's the same Orange characters, but this one takes place in the future and it's told from a different point of view. This one sadly ended up being like a 3-star for me. I wasn't as obsessed with this future volume as I was with like the rest of the Orange volumes. I still think though that if you like Orange and you like the story, I do think this is worth checking out because it does give you some answers about things from, you know, the Orange series that you might have never gotten answers to. But at the same time, like, I just wasn't a huge fan of reading from this character's perspective in this book, and I also thought some parts of this were kind of like hard to follow, to be honest, like, because it would jump back and forth between like 10 years ago and then now and then 10 years ago, and it was kind of hard to keep track of like which part was which. So this one sadly was just a 3-star for me, but it honestly does not impact at all how much I love Orange as a whole. Like, Orange is iconic. And then I also read Your Name volumes 2 and 3. These are the mangas that were adapted from the anime. Like, there's a movie in an anime called Your Name that I'm really fucking obsessed with, and last month I read the first volume, and then now I finally read volumes 2 and 3. And I will say that I think volumes 2 and 3 were not as solid for me as volume 1, because volume 1 was 5 stars. It was so freaking good, but these two just kind of like lacked something for me. I think volume 2, it really does read kind of like a middle of the story. Like, there's not a lot happening in here plot-wise. It's just kind of like moving the plot along. And then volume 3, this is like the final, you know, conclusion to this series. And I don't really know why they felt the need to separate this story into 3 separate volumes, to be honest, because I feel like it just wasn't necessary to be written in that way. But this was also good. It was fine. I gave this one 3 stars. I don't think this manga impacted me emotionally nearly as much as the anime movie did, so I would highly recommend the anime movie over these mangas. I also think too that if I hadn't seen the movie first, I think I would have been so confused by what was happening at the end, because I found it to be a little bit hard to follow, and even though I had seen the movie, I still was a little bit confused. So like, if you haven't seen the movie, you would probably have no freaking clue what's going on. So yeah, this was alright. This was 3 stars. I highly recommend the anime movie though. The anime is fantastic. And I also was finally able to read Blood on the Tracks Volume 5. I am currently so hooked on this series. This is like a thriller horror manga series that's about this young boy and his mom and their kind of weird, strange relationship. It's very like Bates Motel vibes, and this one was amazing. This one was no different. I gave this one 4 stars. I'm just really hooked on this series right now. I'm hoping that I can get the next few volumes from my library for next month, because reading these one at a time is torture. Like, as soon as it ends, I just want to get to the next thing. And this one, oh my gosh, they read so quick. Like, you can literally read these in like 15 minutes because they're mostly, you know, just drawings, and the way that this author draws their facial expressions, it's just incredible. It's so good. Highly recommend Blood on the Tracks. And then the last manga that I read was Sweat and Soap Volume 6. And this is one that I just read last night, and this manga series is so cute and it brings me so much joy. I'm kind of glad that I'm taking my time with this manga series instead of just like binging them all at once, because I kind of want to, you know? This is just so cute. It's so precious. These characters just mean everything to me. I love their relationship. I feel like their relationship is so realistic and so healthy. I love the way they communicate with each other about how they're feeling. I also love that this one kind of takes place around Valentine's Day. It just felt very like the perfect time to be reading this one. And yeah, I gave this one 4 stars. I'm obsessed. I can't wait to read more of Sweat and Soap soon. Alright, and so now on to all of the books that I read this month. I started off the year with reading The Hacienda, and this is the first book that I read for the video that I did where I read, you know, popular books from 2022 that I never got around to. This is definitely one of those books that I always wanted to get to, because this one's a like historical fiction horror kind of setting where we're following this woman who's going to be living in this hacienda that may or may not be haunted. There's some weird unexplainable shit happening here, and this book was good. I think I ended up giving this one like a 3.5 out of 5 stars. It's definitely accurate in its depiction of comparing itself like Mexican Gothic meets Rebecca. I would say that's 100% accurate. The atmosphere is really great in this book, and there was a surprising amount of like goriness to some of the scenes that I was not anticipating. There was also kind of this like forbidden romance that was happening throughout this book, and that was probably my favorite aspect of the book. Like, I'm not gonna lie, like that's what kept me flipping the pages, you know? But yeah, overall, I feel like this was around a 3.5 for me. It's not a new favorite, but I really enjoyed my time while I was reading it. And then for that video, I also did read Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. I read this one because it won the sci-fi category on Goodreads. And this story is one that involves, you know, a pandemic, and it involves some like time travel aspects to it. And this book, we follow characters in some very different time periods. Like in the beginning, it takes place in like 1910 or something like that. And then we get a chapter that takes place in like 2020. And then we get one that takes place in like 2204. And then we get one that takes place in like 2402 or something. Like, it takes place during, wow, a wide range of years. And this story was a little bit hard to follow for me at times, because in the beginning, it wasn't clear to me like how these parts were even connected, and so for a long time it almost felt like they were reading as like their own separate individual stories. It's not until much later on in the book where you start to realize like what's actually going on and how they're connected, but I do feel like a lot of this book still went over my head for me personally. Like, I don't know what it was, but some of it was just really confusing, but I do think that the writing was so freaking beautiful in this book. This book and Station 11, like, wow, her writing is just so mesmerizing and so relatable and so beautiful. And so I ended up giving Sea of Tranquility 3 stars, and then I ended up picking up Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmis, and this one is a historical fiction novel. We're following this woman named Elizabeth Zott, who is working in science, and she's working in chemistry in the early 1950s through the 1960s. We kind of follow her life over a period of like 10 or more years, and this book was an unexpected favorite. Like, this was a 5-star book for me. I was not expecting to love this book the way that I did. Elizabeth Zott, for me is the reason why I ended up loving this book as much as I did, because I feel like she's one of those characters who, you know, she comes around every once in a lifetime, you know, like she gives very much like Jo March vibes, where she's like one of those female characters who like questions authority and questions society and questions traditions and wonders, why do we do the things that we do and why do we live in such a sexist world? And she was just such an incredible protagonist to read, and definitely a character that's gonna stay with me for such a long time, and that's why this book was 5 stars for me. I also just really loved the way that this book was written. It was written in a way that just made me feel so happy, and like this book is just like a warm hug or something like that. I don't know how to explain it, but this book and the characters and the moments and the quotes, like all of it, I just loved it so fucking much. Alright, and the next up I ended up reading Black Cake, which this one was one that I had on my TBR for so freaking long, for like over a year, so I'm glad that I finally got to this one this month. And in this story we're following these two siblings named Byron and Benny, and their mother has recently passed away, and she's left behind this inheritance as well as this family recipe for this Caribbean traditional black cake. I'm sad to say that I didn't enjoy this book as much as I wanted to. You know, this one's more of a like literary fiction style of writing. I think something that made this book really hard to get into for me is the fact that we're following from so many different characters' perspectives. I want to say we're getting at least maybe like 10 different character point of views in this book, and to be honest, I just don't feel like that was necessary. Like, I feel like the story could have been so much more powerful for me if we had just been following maybe the siblings and then maybe like one other character, but I don't think all of the point of views were necessary in this book, and it just made me feel not really connected to any of the characters because we would spend such little time with each of them and just jump around. And also like the jumping around with like the timeline too, like the time period, I also found it to be kind of confusing because some chapters would be taking place more in like present day, and then some chapters would be taking place in like the 60s. So sadly I ended up giving this one 2 stars. It just was not a fave. I didn't love it the way that I wanted to, but if you want to hear any of my thoughts on these first 4 books that I talked about, then I will have my vlog linked down below where I discuss them in a lot more detail. Right, and then next up I was working on my 3 thrillers vlog that I did this month. The first book that I read for that video was Just the Nicest Couple. This is a thriller that just went on sale this month in January, and this one started off so strong for me because in this book we're following these 2 different couples. In one of the couples we follow from the guy's point of view, and then in the other couple we follow from the wife's point of view. And what ends up happening is that from the characters that were not following their perspectives, they end up like meeting in the park one night, some kind of situation happens with them, and then the next day the husband is missing. And so we're following from the perspective of the husband who thinks that his wife might have had some kind of involvement in whatever happened with this other guy going missing. It was really interesting too because the 2 characters are both, the 2 women are both teachers, and so they work together and they're friends, and so they're trying to figure out like what could have happened to this guy that went missing. It was like a very typical thriller setup, but I was for the most part having a really fun time reading it just because I found it to be so entertaining. But then honestly the ending of this book just completely falls apart, and it's so ridiculous and so predictable and so dumb, and so I ended up giving this book 3 stars overall because, you know, I don't know, it's a very average thriller. That's all I can say about it. And then I ended up reading The Villa by Rachel Hawkins, and sadly, once again, this book was not for me. I ended up giving this one 2 stars. This one is quite a bummer, you know, because I have, for the most part, enjoyed the other books by Rachel Hawkins. She's also the author of The Wife Upstairs and Reckless Girls, which I did enjoy both of those books, but I feel like this is by far my least favorite from her so far. And the premise of this one sounds interesting enough, you know, because we're following these 2 women named Emily and Chess, and they are both authors, and they're going to be going to this villa that's in Italy because they want to finish writing their books together. And then we also do get flashback chapters to like the 1970s where there was a murder that took place at this villa that they're going to be staying at. And so it felt like this book was trying to do a lot of things because it felt like it was trying to give like White Lotus vibes, and like with the flashback chapters in the 1970s, it felt like it was very like Fleetwood Mac inspired, maybe like Daisy Jones and the Six, but like with murder. I don't really know, but to be honest, I just didn't care at all about the past chapters that were in the 70s. Like, oh my god, I could not care less. I was skimming through those chapters. I thought they were so boring. And then I read Secluded Cabin Sleep 6 by Lisa Unger, which sadly also didn't end up really working for me. Like, that thriller vlog was just a total hot mess. This was also a 2-star book for me, and I'm really sad about it because this one I feel like also started off really strong. Something that I think was kind of annoying in this book is that we are following from the perspective of like 6 characters, if not even more. Like, I don't know, I kind of lost count at that point. point. And in this story, we're following these 3 couples who they get this like cabin that's out in the woods and they're gonna be staying there on a weekend getaway. But then there's like this storm coming and all of these things start happening, and you would think we'd be following from the perspective of the 6 people that are at this cabin, but no, to make it extra confusing, we only follow from the point of view of like 3 of them, and then we get 3 other point of views that seem kind of random. It's like somebody who's like watching the cabin, it's like the person who owns the cabin, and then we also get a perspective that takes place like back in the day, like a past point of view of like this kid. We don't know how he's involved. There's just a lot going on in this book, okay? There's a lot. And I thought it was an interesting setup, you know, like I love the idea of these couples going to this cabin and then something weird starts happening and they feel like they're being watched, and then, you know, shit really hits the fan. Like I thought it was gonna be so good, but this was just so not what I was looking for, you know, like this ended up being so boring at the end of it. Like the first 100 pages were really good, and then after that, oh my god, I got so freaking bored. I was not very impressed either by like the twists in this book or the way that it all ended up connecting at the end. I just thought it was really ridiculous. And so yeah, this was 2 stars from me. Next up, for my Patreon exclusive vlog that I was working on, I ended up reading Astrid Parker Doesn't Fail by Ashley Herring Blake, and this one is a romance that I was pretty excited about because this is the sequel to Delilah Green Doesn't Care, but this one can be read as a standalone. I'm pretty sure we're just following the character Astrid, who is, I think it's Delilah's sister, and this one ended up being so cute. Like it was so good. I was kind of worried that I wouldn't like this one as much because I wasn't the biggest fan of Delilah Green Doesn't Care. Like I thought that book was fine. This one, I just connected so much to Astrid in this book. I love in this book that her name is Astrid Parker. Like that's already so cute. And then her love interest, her name is Jordan Everwood. Like, are those not the cutest names you've ever freaking heard? I also love that this book, it starts off with this major almost like enemies to lovers or like hate to love or like this awkward thing, you know, because these characters meet when they slam into each other by accident on the street, and you know, Jordan spills all of her coffee all over her like white, you know, outfit and skirt, and Astrid's just having one of those days where like this is the final straw. Like she's so fucking pissed and she just like lets her have it and goes off on her, and then it's like kind of awkward because she's like, oh my god, like I feel terrible. And then shortly after that, they find out that they're gonna have to be working together on this show because they are both gonna be on this HGTV show where Astrid is gonna be, you know, the designer, and then Jordan is going to be like the carpenter that's gonna have to be working with her on the show. And so we get this awkward like, oh shit, now they're gonna have to be working together, and they just had this awkward exchange, and I loved it. I loved it so fucking much. I also feel like I really love you know, the exploration of, you know, discussing how, because at the beginning of this book, you know, Astrid thinks that she's straight or she doesn't really know her sexuality, and I love how throughout this book Astrid's kind of like learning new things about herself, like the fact that she might be attracted to women. And I kind of love the idea of, you know, exploring your sexuality even in your 30s or even like a little bit later in life, you know, like I just love that so much. I gave this one 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. And then for that video, I also ended up reading Luster, and this one was a total surprise. This book was so, it was so freaking good. So in this story, we're following this young black woman who gets involved with this white man who's in an open marriage, and like the wife knows about them, and like they're in an open marriage, and she's going to be, you know, pursuing this white man and getting involved in their open marriage. And I wasn't sure if this was going to be something that I'd be interested in because I had heard the writing was very like literary fiction, but the writing in this book is absolutely gorgeous. Like this book was absolutely amazing because of the writing. Like the writing was just so good. It was so vivid. It was so lyrical. It was so beautiful. Like I ended up giving this book 4.5 out of 5 stars, mostly just because of the writing alone. Like I knocked off half a star because I wasn't the biggest fan of like where this plot ended up going in the end. Like I just was a little bit underwhelmed by the end of the story, but at the same time, like I cannot deny that this is some of the most gorgeous writing I've ever seen in my life, and I cannot wait for this author to publish more things. Just an example of this writing that I thought was so stunning. It says, his joy is raw in a way that makes me feel like I can unzip my skin suit and show him all the ooze inside, but not yet. There's a sadness about his fervor, the way it feels slightly put on as if he has something to prove. He looks over at me when we reach the top. The wind cards through his hair. Behind his eyes, I see myself fractured into pieces. Suddenly, it feels painful to be this ordinary, to be this open to him, and he looks at me and pretends I am not just a cheaper version of a fast Italian car. Like, what the fuck, dude? This writing was so beautiful. It was so thought-provoking. It was so interesting. It just really, like, rolls off the tongue, you know? Like, those words, oh my gosh. This author just really has a way with words, and I was super freaking impressed with this, so highly recommend Luster. It was a great time. And then the next book that I read this month was Mother Thing. I actually read this from my friend Elizabeth's book club. It was her first month hosting her book club for her Midnight Society book club, so I will put the link down below if you want to see the full live show where we both discussed this book. But this book is kind of hard to even talk about because it is categorized, I think, under the horror genre, although I would consider this much more like a psychological kind of slow burn horror type of book. We're following this protagonist named Abby, and her mother-in-law has recently passed away. She ended up taking her life like right at the beginning of this book, and then her husband spirals into this really bad depression because of that. And Abby herself is really wanting a baby, and she's struggling with pregnancy in this book. And this book was also so freaking well written. This book was a 5-star book for me. I absolutely loved it so much. I feel like this is one of those like really weird kind of horror books that I don't think I could recommend for everyone, because I can see a lot of people really not liking this. But I think if you liked kind of like Our Wives Under the Sea, or you know, Bunny, or kind of like weird horror books like that just are kind of like psychological and kind of get in your head, I feel like you could enjoy this one. This horror novel has, you know, such a great depiction of, you know, mental health and like depression and grief after you're going through something like that, and how those things are real and they're very scary. And I also think, you know, showing how grief can really change a person is a big theme in this book. I also think, you know, just the idea of this, the concept of like a mother thing, and how we want something to comfort us like a mother, or we're drawn to things that will give us comfort. I think all of that discussion in this book is just so smart and so well thought out and really beautiful. I wanted to share, there's this like really beautiful quote in this book when it's talking about depression, and Abby asks him, she says, "Can you tell me again what it feels like to be depressed?" And he said, "It's like being dead, only without peace. Your sense of self, the thing in you that loves your family and your friends and, you know, experiences joy or even pain, that thing is gone, and you're just left with your walking corpse, and it's just as dreadful as any corpse is, but it's you." And yeah, wow. Isn't that incredible? Like, damn, that is deep. And then from my friend Jessie's book club, my friend Jessie, they run the NB book club. I ended up reading All the White Spaces this month. We have not yet had the live show on this yet, so I don't want to get too much into my thoughts yet, but this one is a horror book that involves a trans main character. This one is actually a historical fiction novel, which I did not realize for some reason when I was jumping into this book, but it takes place in the 1920s, and it also takes place in Antarctica, like right after World War I. And this book was super outside of my comfort zone, because not only because it's like historical fiction, but I also like rarely ever enjoy reading books that are kind of about war, or like during the war, like right around war times. That's usually like my least favorite kind of historical fiction to read. But this book is really interesting because the horror elements of this book kind of involve this like paranormal entity that ends up being a thing a little bit later on in the story. I thought this book, I'm not gonna lie, it was really hard to get into, because not only is the writing, you know, very historical, but it feels very more like, you know, day-to-day life in this, you know, right after the war, and these people are like gearing up to go out on the water. It's like they're gonna be on their boat in the sea. There are so many characters that you're following at the beginning of this book. There's even a list right at the beginning of the book that kind of like shows you all the characters that you're gonna be following, and I was immediately overwhelmed by the amount of characters that we were going to be following in this story. But I do think like the most positive things I can say about this is that this has got to be one of the most atmospheric books that I've ever read, like with the, you know, descriptions of like the ice and the snow and the cold. Like I felt cold while I was reading this. Like I felt like I was fucking there. I felt it in my bones, you know. So like I totally think that this book nailed it on like the atmospheric vibes. I also do think if you're the kind of person who likes books that have like a historical feel to it, this definitely had all of those vibes. But I think those last, you know, 150 pages or so really picked up, and the story got really interesting, and I was really invested in what was happening. I also really do appreciate the perspective of a trans character, especially in these, you know, historical times in the 1920s. Like that was a really interesting and unique point of view to get. For all of those reasons, I ended up giving this book 3 stars. It's not a new favorite of mine. I struggled through so much of this book because of the writing style and because of the historical feel to it, and just with all, like, there are so many characters, but there are so many things that I enjoyed about this book. I have very mixed feelings on this one. And then for my book club, the book troop, this month we ended up reading Wonderland by Jennifer Hillier, and I did a whole live show with my friend Liv. I will I'll have the live show linked down below if you missed it. This story is, you know, it's kind of a thriller horror. It does list it as horror under Goodreads, but honestly, no, it's more of like a thriller, almost like a detective-based thriller. We're following this detective named Vanessa, and she recently has moved to Washington State, where there's this like Wonderland theme park that is all fictional, by the way. I wish I could actually go to Wonderland, but I cannot. Vanessa, when she's working there, they're saying that all these young male employees are going missing from Wonderland, and it's been happening for years, and like there's a lot of weird shit happening in this small little seaside town. This story did not really work for me, I'm not gonna lie. This was 2 stars. I wasn't a huge fan of this book, and I'm really sad about it because, you know, not only because it's my book club pick, so I'm sad that I didn't enjoy it, but also because why is it that anytime I pick a Jennifer Hillier for my book club, I don't enjoy it that much? And it's like, it's weird because I do love most of her books, you know, but it's like every time I pick one of her books for my book club, it ends up being one that I don't end up enjoying as much, and it makes me so sad. The writing in this book felt very dated for me. Like, this book came out in 2015, but the writing in this feels very like late 90s, early 2000s for me. I don't even know how to explain it, but the writing just feels very dated in that way. I also feel like this book also had so many characters. Like, we're following from the perspective of so many different characters in this book, and I just didn't really care about any of them. Like, I didn't care about a single character in this book. I also think too, you know, for as much of this book that took place in this Wonderland theme park, and like there's this cool idea with like this clown museum, I feel like so much of the story didn't feel nearly as atmospheric as I wanted it to feel. And so yeah, I mean, this was kind of a bummer. It was 2 stars for me. I did a whole discussion on it with Liv. If you want to hear more of my thoughts, I'll have the live show link down below. All right, and then the last video that I worked on for the month of January was a video where TikTok recommended me horror books, and I just chose random books that I saw on my TikTok and we read it for a video. The first book that I picked up for that video was House of Hunger. This one is by Alexis Henderson, and this one is the same author as Year of the Witching. And this is one that it's kind of confusing to even explain. It's kind of like a fantasy historical fiction type of horror book where we're following this woman who's a blood maid. It's kind of like vampire-ish because they're all gonna be like sucking her blood basically. Like, she's gonna be offering herself and people suck her blood and then she gets paid for it essentially. This book was so fucking disturbing. Oh my gosh, like I am definitely the kind of person that gets really queasy whenever there's mentions of like blood or like needles or like sucking blood, and so I don't read vampire books very often. You know, it's not my go-to horror genre thing. The writing was great, okay? The writing was well done. I think this author is a really great writer. I just don't know if this author's books are for me. I just don't know if this author's for me because, you know, I tried to read The Year of the Witching and I got kind of bored and set it aside. I don't know if it's a forever DNF, but it was a DNF at the time. And now with this one, I'm just feeling kind of similar where I feel like just kind of bored throughout the story sometimes, and then the other times I feel nauseous because the writing is just so descriptive. It's so bloody and gory that I get like, oh my god, it's sick. And so I just feel very torn on whether or not I want to continue reading this author's books in the future because I just don't think this book was for me, but I do recognize that this was probably a pretty good book for other people. I gave this one 3 stars. And then the next thing that I read for that video was Dirty Heads. This one is a kind of cosmic coming of age horror. This one is pretty short as well. It's more like novella length because it's only about 130 pages. And yeah, in this book we're following this young queer teenage boy who's living in the 90s. There's like this evil entity that's like living in the family's basement or something like that, and then it starts to try to get inside of the family. I don't really know, to be honest. Like, I don't know. This book was very confusing. I appreciate the coming of age aspects of this book, but at the same time I feel like this book didn't even really feel like horror to me for a long time. I thought it was kind of interesting at first because we do get the perspective of like this evil entity thing, and I was like, oh, that's unique, that's cool, and it was really creepy at first, but then it very quickly kind of got cheesy and repetitive in my opinion with that whole aspect of it. And as much as I appreciate, you know, like the representation of a queer teen living in the 90s and how that's kind of scary in its own way because you don't know if like your family and your friends are going to accept you for who you are. Like, I definitely get that there are some underlying, you know, real life fears that are happening throughout this book, and I definitely appreciated those. But otherwise, like, I did not think the evil entity in this book was very scary. Like, nothing about this book was scary for me. It was just given cheese and I couldn't couldn't do it. And so I ended up giving this one 2 stars. It's probably my least favorite thing that I've read so far this year, which makes me so sad because this cover is really cool and I wanted to love it, but sadly I did not. And then I also read Little Paranoias, which this one is a collection of short stories. This one's also pretty short too. It's only about 140-ish pages. All of these stories are very different and they're all very strange. I think my favorite story in this whole collection is this one called Always in My Ear, which is about these like 2 teenage girls who are about like 14 and they both want to be serial killers together and they kind of like make plans to do things and they also get obsessed with like true crime. And it was really interesting. It was my favorite out of the collection, but honestly, like there was so many in this that I just did not vibe with. There are so many short stories in this collection that are only about like a page long, and most of those, like there were some that were cool, but most of the ones that were only a page long, I just thought that they were so cheesy and just kind of like lame. And then there were some in here that read more like poetry, like they were just like different stanzas, and those ones didn't really work for me either. Like I don't know, I'm a huge fan of short stories when it comes to the horror genre, but I feel like at the same time I enjoyed the ones in this a lot more that were just a little bit longer. Like I think the perfect length for me for a short story is like 10 to 30 pages. Like that kind of gives you enough to get invested and get interested, but then it doesn't need to be that long. I don't know, this was alright. I ended up giving this one 3 stars as well overall. And then the last book that I read this month is by far my favorite book that I've read this year so far. I'm obsessed with this book. It's Any Man by Amber Tamblyn, and this is a horror novel. I don't know, it's kind of hard to describe because I feel like this one is genre bending. It's definitely like it has those horror elements, but I don't know if I would fully categorize this as a horror book. And in this story, we're following this violent serial rapist who's a woman, and she's going around sexually harassing these different men. The way that this book is written is really interesting and also really beautiful and heartbreaking because we're following different men in each part of this book. And so in this book, you're getting, I want to say like 4 or 5, maybe even 6 parts. And in each part of the book, we follow a different one of her male victims. And there is so much discussion in this book, you know, about what it's like to be a man who's been sexually assaulted by a woman and the way that our society reacts to that kind of thing and tries to act like it's not real, or tries to act like he is a coward, or like he could have done something, or like, you know, the discourse around, you know, men being sexually assaulted in this book is just so relevant, and it's so horrific the way that our society responds to men who have been sexually assaulted. And the whole conversation in this book is just so fucking powerful. Like, I know that I've said it time and time again that I don't really like books these days that only follow around like sexual assault, because I find that that's a topic for me that's really hard to read. Like, I don't know why I get so sensitive to it, and it's really hard for me to read sometimes, but this was absolutely incredible. Like, this was so fucking well written, like so well written. I felt like I knew all of these men. Like, I felt like I could know them. Their characters were so well fleshed out. I also feel like if you plan to check out this, highly recommend the audiobook. Oh my gosh, the audiobook is amazing. It's a full cast audiobook. There's like sound effects on it. There's like phone calls, like radio talk shows, like so many sounds throughout the book. In this book, I mean, obviously it has some very intense trigger warnings for anything, you know, related to sexual assault or abuse or even, you know, self-harm. Like, there is a lot of really dark and really hard topics covered in this book, and honestly, like, the ending of this book, I was crying. Like, I could not believe some of the things happening at the end of this book, like, and the way that it hit me so hard. Like, there was this one chapter where we were reading towards the end where my jaw was just like hanging open the whole time because I couldn't believe what I was reading, and it was so sad and so horrific, but also just so powerful that I got like full body goosebumps, and it was amazing. And there's this one quote that really stuck with me, like, just to read a small piece of it because I don't want to, you know, get into anything spoilery, but they said, "How can you go on living when you're now being lived in, when you've been invaded?" And they says, "How can you end your own suffering without ending completely?" And like quotes like that are just very, you know, common throughout this book. I think this book just does such an incredible job of, you know, shining a light on this topic and bringing up some really relevant points, and it's very thought-provoking and it's very moving, and I fucking loved it. I can't even speak highly enough about this book. I loved it so fucking much. This was definitely a 5-star. I would not be surprised if this ends up in my like top 10 or my top 5 of the whole year because I loved it so much. That's a wrap on January. I'm so glad to have found some new favorite books this month. Like, I know I did read quite a bit that I didn't enjoy, like I can see that, but at the same time I feel like I did discover a few new favorites. I love too that, you know, most of the favorite books that I had this month were books that I was reading for videos that I was doing, where like I don't know if I ever would have picked these books up on my own, but like I read this one because it was popular on Goodreads, and then I read this one because I drew it out of my Patreon prompt, you know, jar, and then Emma Roberts really loved this book and I read it because of Emma Roberts, and then Any Man, I read it because of a TikTok video, and even like Mother Thing, I read this because of my friend Elizabeth's book club. You know, it's just interesting that all of these books, like I don't know if I ever would have like picked them up on my own, but I read them for videos or for a book club, and then I ended up absolutely loving them. And so that's what I love so much about reading. It's like you never know what you're gonna find out there, you know, like you never know what's gonna end up being a new favorite, and I love that. So let me know, how did the month of January go for you? How was your reading this month? How many things did you read? Did you find any new favorites? And if you did, I would love to know the new favorites. And also, of course, let me know if you've read any of the books I mentioned in my wrap up. Let me know how you feel about them. Do we have any similar feelings about things? Thank you so much for watching as always, and I will see you very soon with my February TBR. Hopefully that'll be up very soon in these next couple of days. So thank you so much. Bye!